So,
Well, okay, ready? Hi, everyone. Welcome to Wine Wednesday number 4, or as I'm calling it, the 57th day of shelter in place here in Napa. I'm Chris Wolf, and my husband Randy's joining me, and our winemaker Victoria Coleman today. And we wanted to give you a sneak peek at a rare Lobo vintage. I thought I'd kind of lay the groundwork first for our surprise by talking about birds and wine. Kind of interesting topic. I see some more people coming in. As you all know, birds can do very nasty things to vineyards by eating the grapes when they fly in, so we have to take some precautions for that. But for our purposes today, I'm going to mention one bird in particular. It's called the little blackbird. And that's the French word for this particular wine that we are talking about today. It's the second most popular wine grape in America after its other sibling, who is much more aggressive, Cabernet. It's believed that the first time this grape was used in making wine was in the late 1700s, when a French Bordeaux winemaker formally put this grape varietal on his red blend as an ingredient. But the grape didn't arrive in California until the mid-19th century and was used primarily as 100% varietal wine. Let me see. Okay. It wasn't until vintner Warren Winarski, which some of you might recognize from Stag's Leap Vineyard, encouraged winemakers here in the valley to go back to the Bordeaux roots and use it as a blending grape for red wines again. Right now, currently California and Washington grow most of this varietal. And if you haven't guessed it yet, the varietal is Merlot. The grape is Merlot. We grow Merlot only up on our vineyard here at Atlas Peak, which is 1,350 square feet above sea level. But 2017 changed our perspective about this particular variety. And I'm going to let Randy tell you about it before Victoria goes into the wine profile itself. Randy?
we started planting Cabernet Sauvignon on Atlas Peak more than 10 years ago. And it's just a perfect terroir for Cabernet Sauvignon. It's the only vineyard and the only varietal that we've never sold to another winery. We always use it 100% for Lobo wines. And after consulting with our winemaker, Victoria, who you're going to hear from soon, we decided to plant some blending fruit, what we thought of, I think, as blending fruit on Atlas Peak. We planted Merlot and we also planted Petit Verdot. There are traditionally 5 grapes that frequently can comprise a great Bordeaux wine, and Merlot and Petit Verdot are 2 of those blending grapes, the others being Cab Franc and Malbec. So we consistently then used that wine to blend with our Cab until the Atlas fire of 2017. And again, some of you know at least that not only was our home and guest house wiped out by the Atlas fire, but also we lost about 30% of our vineyards on Atlas Peak, and we lost the entirety of the Cabernet Sauvignon, which was still on the vine. Because it's the slowest ripening of any of our grapes, we had been planning to pick our Cabernet Sauvignon about, I think it was 3 days after the fire struck. Because Merlot ripens a little more quickly, fortunately, we had already picked the Merlot, and but we didn't have a great deal of it, essentially enough to effectively blend. So then we went ahead and made the wine. I think my intention at least was to sell it, and that would have been, I think, a conventional response, until Chris and Victoria and I went and barrel tasted it after a few months, just to test the quality, and we were so impressed with it that we said, well, hell with it. Let's make it ourselves. We may not have a lot of it, but it's delicious. Let's make it. And it'll be essentially a unique wine because I certainly don't expect this circumstance to happen again. We only made 40 cases of the wine, and we're getting ready to release it. So that's the backdrop. I can tell you a little bit of my take on Merlot and a little bit about the vineyard where it comes from, and then Victoria can tell you about the wine. Merlot is always struck me as kind of the stepchild in Bordeaux, and that's unfortunate. For those of you that have seen the movie Sideways, I actually happen to agree with the basic theme of the movie, that it's basically a love affair with Pinot Noir, which I share, but Merlot definitely gets a bad rap in the movie. In fact, there are great wines that come from Bordeaux. Some of you may be familiar, for example, with Chateau Petrus, which is one of the most famous Bordeaux wines in the world. But a lot of people don't know that Chateau Petrus is typically 100% Merlot. It's not Cabernet Sauvignon. And so you can make a great, truly world-class wine out of Merlot grapes. It doesn't have to have Cabernet Sauvignon in with it. When we planted Merlot, we did, of course, a lot of research on different clones and settled for two different clones, 181 and 347. 181 in particular has been traced way back when to Pomerol, which is where Chateau Petrus is made. And so again, we're tied, I think, to the French roots for this wonderful Bordeaux varietal. Once you taste this wine, I think you'll see what I'm talking about. Merlot is introduced to Cabernet Sauvignon primarily to add a fresh fruitiness, kind of a softer fruitiness. And for me, Merlot typically adds kind of a silkiness to the wine, especially on the finish. It tends to mute some of the tannins in Cabernet Sauvignon. Merlot has very supple tannins, and as a result adds a smoothness to the wine that I really love. So, but let's hear from Victoria about the wine.
Thanks, Randy. Hi, everyone. So this 2017 Merlot, it's interesting because I don't think I've ever had a hillside Merlot, only a Cabernet. So this still, I think, reflects hillside fruit. It has, just going into this wine, the texture of it, it's fleshy and it's silky at the same time. It's creamy, but it still has the structure of mountain fruit. This wine in particular is very interesting to smell. I was saying to Chris before we got on, so much is going on with this wine, but I get like black cherry, violets. It's got an herbal freshness to it, but it's more like wet forest, a lot of spice, like cinnamon. It's very interesting to smell. You get candied fruit, maybe like plum jam, dark chocolate. It's got anise to it, spicy. And you get like a hint of caramel on the finish. We used probably about 60% new French oak on this wine. And you don't detect it. It was more, I think, polished when we were tasting it early on. There's a specific barrel that I like to use for Merlot when we're making the wine to blend with the cab, and it gives more of like a softer. The Merlot is soft itself, but this barrel typically polishes the wine up. So the tannins, you feel them in the wine, but they're really velvety, soft, polished tannins. And going forward, because of the fruit that we did lose in the fire, we have a 2018 vintage I don't know if that's our direction that we're going forward with to actually produce a Merlot, but now we have a little more excess due to the fact that we did lose some Cabernet vines to the fire. So we're getting ready to bottle that, and I'm really liking that vintage even more so for Merlot.
Well, we'll see how people respond, how people like the wines. We'll see if the rest of you like it as much as we do.
So Randy, we don't actually have a 2017 Atlas Peak Cabernet, is that correct?
That is correct, and hopefully that is a one-off. Hopefully we will not repeat that. For those of you that are cab lovers, though, don't be horribly concerned, because our Napa Valley cab, which comes from our Oaknall vineyard, was just fine. It's a beautiful wine. We'll be releasing that next year.
Anybody have any questions?
Chris, I do.
Okay, Lynn, go ahead.
When will this be available to commoners like me?
It's right now, it's not officially released, but it is on the website, on the store, under the drop down, and you go to pre-release, and you have to log in as a pack member or an alpha member, and then you will see the wine and the description and be able to purchase it. It won't actually be available to the public for a while.
Okay.
Let me also say that I mentioned earlier the area of Pomerol in Bordeaux and Chateau Petrus. You can't touch a bottle of Chateau Petrus for less than $2,500, and ours is less.
It's very spicy. Spicy and earthy, very fruity, but the spiciness is coming through in the earthiness of the wine.
So I have a question for you, Victoria. I mentioned earlier that a lot of people treat Merlot as kind of the stepchild in Bordeaux. And it seems to me that there's an analogy to be made to Grenache in Burgundy, which I think is also more commonly used as blending fruit, but can make an outstanding wine in and of itself, and yet just doesn't get the recognition. When people think of Burgundy, they immediately jump to Pinot Noir. Do you think that's a fair comparison?
I think it's fair, but for me, you know, the first thing I ever knew about wine was probably Merlot and Riesling, coming from Washington State. And I think I had my fair share of it when I was at Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, and they did it really well. And they had neighbors around that did it well also. And so I've missed it. And I don't think of it in the way that, like, after that movie that did, you know, it gave that stigma to it. But I've never really thought of Merlot in that way as a stepchild like other people do. I've never been opposed to it, never not wanted to drink it. I don't seek them out because not many people are putting them out there. But I know that Hartwell, they're no longer Hartwell, but they did a fabulous one across the street, the highway from Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. And I just never thought that of Merlot. But I think for everyone else, I think it's a comparison.
Victoria, Sonia asks, how do you describe, or what makes a wine spicy?
What makes a wine
Spicy.
spicy?
Describe it as spicy.
I think you can get like pie spices. You can get, like when I'm talking about the forest, I feel like I'm smelling like cedar, but wet cedar. And to me, that's kind of spicy. So mainly in the pie spice or of that, within that range. or like an anise spice when you think of spices.
How much of that comes from the grapes and how much comes from the barrel?
I think a lot of it can come from the barrel when you're not detecting the oak itself, but you're getting what the wood is giving to you. I think a lot of it comes from the barrel. There are varieties that I think that do give spice. I wouldn't say Merlot is necessarily one of them, but it's also like what's coming from the land. Just up on Atlas Peak, we have there's a lot of earthiness up there, but we have just all that rock. So there's a lot of minerality to the wines, I think, more so that come from up there. But we do get a lot of like forest floor type earthiness from it. And the only spice that I'm grabbing from that would be like that it's a wet wood. There's a spiciness coming out of that to the wine.
That's interesting. Well, Jenny asks, how long has the wine been open that you're drinking? I know ours has been open for about half an hour, I believe.
Maybe mine an hour. I'm not one of those need oxygen and let it breathe. I just open it up and drink it. And if it needs it, maybe I'll aerate it, maybe, or just allow it to sit in the glass. But I'm not one of those open it 3 hours before dinner, even though I know that many people do that.
What about the temperature of the wine? What should you store it at? Or drink?
Well, I have a wine fridge and I'm about 54, 55 degrees. So for storing, I think that's too cool to drink red for me. So I would say about 65 for me for red.
Yeah, I was going to
60,
guess that.
65. What would you do, Randy?
About the same. How much Merlot would you typically expect to blend with the Atlas Peak Cab in a normal year?
In a normal year, between 6 and 8%. 8% is about, I think I'm getting it dialed in that when we do our blending, we're always leaning towards like 8% in the blend when we're making our decision.
And why not 15%? And apart from labeling issues, and why not 3%? In other words, what is it about that that makes that the sort of magic range?
I feel like 15% really softens the wine, and it takes away from the Cabernet. The Cabernet, it's like more powerful, I guess. It loses its power when you use more Merlot. It becomes a softer wine, and I think the wine reflects the aromas and the flavors that you get from the vineyard, but the texture is different, and it's like less power maybe to the wine with the Merlot, the weightiness of it.
And if you went to 100% Cab instead of adding the Merlot?
Well, it would be really structured, leaner, not as soft. Or we were doing 100% Cabernet 2009 through 12, and the wine was pretty, I guess, lean with structured tannins. So there was no like fleshiness to it, no softness to it, unless you did use air to like soften those tannins. But I feel like it fills in the cracks. I kind of think of, when I say structured wine, it's almost like looking at having a grid or something and having the squares like be hollowed, and then when you have something to blend into it, it kind of fills those squares, like filling cracks of a frame.
So the percentage of Merlot can vary from year to year when we're blending?
It can, but I think we're
pretty much around.
Few years, we've been kind of like leaning towards, 2015 because of the cold spring that we had at set. So we had pour set or at flowering, we had Pourcet. So we had less Cabernet and we had more Merlot. And we actually had to use the Merlot. And it's a different wine. It's a nice wine, but it's not what I know Atlas Peak Cab to be.
So I know Randy said we also grow Petit Verdot up here for another dimension of blending. And I only consider that as adding the darker, inkier color. But is there something else about Petit Verdot that you think brings to the party here for Cab?
There's a floral component to it. That's a spicy grape. It's got good acid. So, and it grows really well. For whatever reason, it grows really well up there in those rocks. And it ripens early enough with the Cab to do the co-fermentation. But I think it brings like some spice to it and a little bit of a floral component and definitely some acid to it.
I know that the originally from your training in France, that you were very much wedded to what they call field blending. But we weren't able to do that here because they ripen at different times. Is that still true? We don't really do field blending anymore.
Well, no. But with the Petit Verdot, yes.
So Sonia asked, is this 100% Merlot?
It is, yes.
Absolutely is. It was the only wine that survived the fire up here. So it is 100% Merlot, sorry.
So you raise a really interesting issue about field blending or co-fermentation. Victoria, why don't you make the case for co-fermentation? We have a running and I think friendly spar about this issue.
Well, so with the Petit Verdot, I think on its own, you can only use this, like a little bit goes a long way. And so I feel like when you put things together earlier in their life, in earlier stages, it's like making a stew and adding your herbs and letting it marry, you know, with the sauce, like with all the ingredients. It's kind of the same way with the fermentation. So with the Cabernet Sauvignon and the Petit Verdot, I feel like you can use more because they're put together early on. So we almost use, I think this was the first year where we didn't use all of the Petit Verdot with the co-fermentation. And I still think that's because we don't have enough Cab to marry together in the complete blend for Atlas Peak. But I just feel like, as someone once put it, when dogs and cats meet in the street, like it's a fight that's going to happen, right? But when they meet as puppies and kittens, they just love each other and they play together and they grow up loving each other. So that's
Oh my goodness. How am I gonna?
That's an interesting comparison.
That's way too persuasive.
But so it goes, I think, a longer way when you put it together early on.
Well, the counterpoint, of course, sounds so less charming, but it has much more to do with control, as opposed to just putting this amount of grapes in with that amount of grapes and hoping that they marry successfully. There is something to be said for having test tubes and beakers and pipettes, and especially with Petit Verdot to me, because like you say, it doesn't take much to dramatically influence the wine. I remember the first time we blended with Petit Verdot, and seriously, going from 2% Petit Verdot to 2.5% or even 3% produced a markedly different wine. And anyway, that's the part that always makes me nervous about co-fermentation.
Co-ferment, you can use up to 6%.
You can see why I don't usually win these arguments. Well, it's not an argument. It's not even a debate.
So
So Victoria and Randy, what would you pair with this wine? Besides the fact that we can just drink it by itself, which is yummy in itself.
Randy, you go first.
Sure. I think of the Atlas Peak Cab as kind of a steak wine, although it certainly can go with other things. It's extracted. It's certainly the biggest wine that we make, and so you got to have something that stands up to it. Maybe a real spicy pasta, probably lambs, but it's great with short ribs or steak or something like that. The Merlot isn't as constrained. It's fruitier. It's a little softer. I think you could go down the chain, even down to poultry. I don't think I would drink it with a delicate whitefish like sole or something like that. You could even drink it with salmon. It's very versatile for a Bordeaux varietal.
I can tell you what it doesn't go with.
Yeah.
I had a bottle last night and I had Japanese food and it didn't go with the teriyaki. It didn't go with the tempura. It didn't go. There's one other thing I had. Yeah. It was like they did fried chicken and it didn't go with that either. Not the Japanese one anyway.
I think of cheeseburgers or steak frites when we're talking a French Merlot, a little bird, a little black bird.
And I feel like this is not, like it's not an easy drinking Merlot, like what you think of Merlot as. It's like, it's carrying its weight. So I think you can almost treat it like a cab.
Some of the Merlots, the ones that are, I guess, the more typical ones, and certainly the less expensive ones, can be very monotonal. They sort of sacrifice the structure and the spiciness in order to produce that super smooth finish. That's not this wine. I mean, it is smooth and it is silky, but it's complicated. It's more complex than most Merlots that I've had.
So when we're looking at your background, Randy, over your shoulder, that's the Atlas Peak Vineyard looking down, where the rocks are at the bottom. So the Merlot is about...
There's some right there.
Yeah,
And there's some right over there.
Yeah. So that's where it's grown. You're looking right at it.
And we have 4 blocks of grapes on Atlas Peak, and you're looking at what we call Block 4, which is not only the largest, but one of the most exciting blocks because it has a perfect southern exposure to the sun. The sun goes from, let me see if I can do this, goes from here to here all day long. So you get a great sort of uniform sun exposure for the fruit. And once again, the slope is about 15 degrees, and it's just about dead solid perfect for growing what we're growing: Merlot, Petit Verdot, and Cab Sauv.
It's pretty steep.
Yes, it's steep to walk, and it's steep to harvest. I can tell you, after the fire, when Victoria and I were trying to decide whether we could make any of the Cab Sauv, whether it was all ruined, we literally walked every row. Well, we alternated, but we walked every row and tasted berries up and down every row, trying to find any fruit that could be salvaged.
So Mike asks, what might the changes be for the Merlot after 2 to 3 years? You mean in the bottle, or I'm assuming it's in the bottle, but maybe not. Yes, in the bottle, he says.
Well, my guess is that because it does have some tannin to it, that would really soften, make it more elegant. It's already an elegant wine, but the tannins are definitely there giving it structure. So I'm guessing with more time, it would just become more elegant, more opulent, softer.
How long do you two think you could lay some of this wine down in a wine cellar or wine fridge?
Gosh. 10, 15 years, right? I mean, the alcohols are pretty, I think they're ageable because of the acid mainly. And the low pHs. We have higher acids and lower pHs. So I think many of our wines can age for a long time.
Okay. If you've got your video turned on, it should be turned off according to how they tell me to do that in Zoom. You can shut it off. Everybody's pretty mute right now, but if anybody has any other questions.
Say that again, what?
Not everyone's muted.
Yeah.
Mine's not muted.
Outside?
All right.